Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
These are crazy light. But before we get into the details, here's something you guys have been asking for quite some time. And make sure you're watching the shorts videos and/or following on Instagram or TikTok for more content like this, because I've been making these videos, they just haven't been making it into the full reviews. Nonetheless, if this is something you've been waiting for, enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Adidas F50 Hyperfast EVO, what is both the lightest and most expensive option in the new F50 lineup, and for me, by far the most exciting option in that it's a return not just to the roots of F50, but more importantly, the roots of F50 Adizero. A football boot that back in 2010 changed the way we looked at speed boots entirely, introducing a design and system that was significantly lighter than anything else we had ever seen before. An already extreme concept that got pushed even further with the original F50 Adizero Prime, of which I would argue the Hyperfast EVO is the spiritual successor, with the F50 Adizero Crazy Light arguably being the closest thing to what Adidas has just done with the EVO. And of course, we can't talk about the lightest current boot from Adidas without talking about the lightest boot they ever made, period, in the 99 gram Adizero, which is admittedly a very cool technical achievement, but the upper as well as the sole plate is so thin and flimsy, needless to say, there's a reason why they only made them in one size and limited them to just 299 pairs. As for the EVO, however, it's not a big deal just because it's light, it's a big deal because it's also good. In fact, I'd go as far as to say, spoiler alert, I think it's the best super lightweight football boot Adidas have ever made. And also a boot that is extremely different from the Elites. Review on those coming soon, by the way, but we're gonna start here. Hyperfast EVO, what's good, what's bad, how do they feel on feet, and should this be your next pair of speed boots if having something as light as possible is the priority? We're going to discuss all that and more in today's review, so if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, and if you are interested in a pair of EVOs for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you guys enjoy the content, don't forget to drop a like on the video, and if you appreciate the unsugar-coated, unsponsored, brutally honest opinions on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2026. Where first things first, we have to talk about the weight, because that is obviously the main selling feature of the EVO and the feature that, at least for me, gets me the most excited, because while I think we've concluded at this point that lighter boots aren't necessarily going to make you faster, there there is a certain feel from a football boot with a claimed weight of 130 grams that is just different than everything else, even in comparison to other lightweight speed boots in the category. So with that in mind, whenever a boot claims to be extremely light, the question that everyone asks is how much lighter is it than all the other options, especially when they're asking $300 for the EVO. Well, as a point of comparison, I have the regular Elite, part of the new F50 lineup. I have the previous generation F50 Elite that these new F50s, of course, replace. And I have the F50 Plus, which we only technically got in a couple colorways, only one with laces. That is technically the boot that the EVO replaces, even though the overall concept is quite a bit different. But previously it was one of the lightest F50s from the last generation. So all in the same size 9.5 US. So we're gonna start with the F50 EVO, which Adidas has a claimed weight of 130 grams in a size 9. These are half a size bigger, 4.7 ounces, the equivalent of 133 grams, which lines up pretty much perfectly. The claimed weight is very accurate. And of course, the weight of the final product is pretty ridiculously light. We'll change the scale back to ounces and we'll throw on the alternate top end option in the F50 Elite. These in a 9.5 weigh in at 6.4 ounces, the equivalent of 182 grams, which is obviously still very light, but quite a bit more than the EVO. We'll change the scale again and we'll throw on the regular previous generation F50 Elite with laces. These weigh in at 6.6 ounces, the equivalent of 188 grams. So just a few grams more than the Elite model it gets replaced by, but again, much heavier than the EVOs. And then finally, we'll throw on the F50 Plus, again, in the same size 9.5 US. And you can see that these weigh in at 6.55 ounces, the equivalent of 186 grams. So what conclusions can we draw from all of that information? Well, first off, from lightest to heaviest, I have them laid out here on the table. Across the board, the new F50 line, whether you go for the EVOs or the Elites, are lighter than the other laced options as part of the previous generation of F50, so weight reductions across the board. And then I think most importantly, EVO is just ridiculously light in comparison to all of these, where again, if you really want that weightless, nothing on my feet except air sensation, this is probably the football boot that you want to try out. But it's not just about being as light as possible, because when you take as much weight as Adidas have out of a pair of football boots, other problems tend to present themselves. For starters, protection. If getting stepped on is a major concern for you and you want to have a little bit of padding protecting your feet, stay very far away from the EVO. The upper is pretty well as thin as possible and there is no protection to be found here whatsoever, but of course that comes with the territory and is by no means a knock against it. The second concern that a lot of people tend to have is durability. Again, when you make a football boot as thin and light as possible, surely the durability has to suffer. And of course, these have only been out for a week or two now, so it's really difficult for almost anybody to have an accurate opinion or even experience on the overall durability of this boot. Only time will tell in that particular area, but I will say the build quality is very nice, as you'd expect from anything that costs $300, and they actually feel a lot more solid than I was expecting, which leads us into the third thing that typically suffers in extreme weight reduction scenarios, and that is the boot being overly flimsy. Where if you were to just go off of how this boot moves around when I press down on the upper, it looks like it's paper thin with no structure whatsoever. What's nice about making it this thin is they've managed to not make it overly plasticky, because that's often been a direction for a lot of these ultra lightweight thin football boots. Certainly the original F50 Adizero Prime, because it was so thin, it had that firmer plasticky sensation to have enough structure. This has plenty of pliability and for that reason is remarkably comfortable, all things considered. However, they've been very clever about the construction process, where there's quite a few layers of material and really nice reinforcement both on the inside and the outside, where with the laces tied tight, this is a football boot that still very much feels like it stays with you upon quick cuts and changes of direction. Is it quite as responsive and secure as what you'd find from the thicker upper on the standard F50 Elite, or even say something like a Nike Mercurial? No, not necessarily, but out of all the super light iterations of F50 speed boots from Adidas, I do think that these are arguably the most responsive. In saying all of that, the Halo Shell Plus upper that they've created for the Evo in general just feels fantastic. Obviously, raw, barefoot feel is what they're trying to offer here, and that is definitely what you get. The finish on the surface is relatively smooth all the way through. Despite the graphics, they don't really have that same gritty texture or raised texture like you get on the F50 Elite. So if you don't like having extra grip on the ball, this over the standard F50 might be more your cup of tea. And I also really like what they've done internally with the Evo, where if you loosen the laces and take a peek inside, you will notice that there is a halo cage reinforcement, which is very similar to the sprint cage reinforcement, again found on that OG F50 Adizero from 2010. This implementation, however, is much thinner, but still allows it to hold a decent amount of structure without sacrificing the pliability of the material, where again, considering how thin and light these are, they are surprisingly comfortable. And again, I don't want to make this a comparison to the standard F50 Elite because I really do believe they're very different football boots that offer a very different experience overall. But I do like the fact that the Evo maintains the central lacing system, but also gives you a more traditional U-throat construction with that standalone tongue, which of course has its pros and cons depending on personal preference, but the tongue is pretty well the same thickness as the rest of the upper, so it's very uniform in terms of giving you that thin feel all over. And in general, putting the boots on and taking them off is just super easy because of this more traditional design. The tongue is also wide enough to where it wraps along the side of your foot and then kind of tucks in nicely when you tie the laces tight, to the point where I didn't have any issues with the tongue kind of flopping over to the side as you wear the boots, which again is often an issue when you go with this more traditional construction. Another issue that you might expect from a football boot that is as light as possible is overall comfort. Obviously, we talked about the upper feeling quite good, but what about the heel area? Surely they've taken away all the padding and structure and it just feels uncomfortable. Not the case whatsoever. Of course, the boot maintains a low cut design that's a little bit of a different shape than what you'll find from the previous generation F50. Certainly very minimal, and the only thing that I'll criticize lightly here, even though I didn't really have an issue with it, is the way that they've kind of left the edge of the opening with this kind of bonded plasticky material. It's a little bit, not necessarily sharp, but it's rough enough to where if you did leave any exposed skin to touch any of this, I could see that potentially rubbing and causing an issue. As long as you wear proper length socks though, which everybody should be with football boots, it should not be a problem. And like I said, I didn't have any issues with it whatsoever. You of course maintain an external heel counter as part of what is basically the latest and greatest sprint frame. Again, a carryover element that has kind of remained true on F50 models since it was first introduced in 2010. This is a little bit different though. So that's what's providing your rear structure. Up top, plenty of pliability as you'd expect. And then internally, a surprising amount of foam padding. It's a little bit more targeted where down low you don't have a ton, but because this is still really soft and flexible, it's not an issue whatsoever. Very soft cushion to the padding itself, and the liner is this really soft kind of microfiber material that not only feels great against your heel, but also does a nice job of gripping your socks, providing great overall lockdown with the laces tied tight. Although it is worth mentioning that unlike some football boots that have this more traditional lacing system and construction, they do not give you that extra lace hole position if you wanted a little bit of extra lockdown. Will this result in people punching holes in the upper? Probably. That seems to be a trend right now, but if it means anything to you, and of course everyone's feet are a little bit different, with the laces tied tight, heel slippage and or lockdown was not an issue whatsoever. Again, I'd go as far as to say that this is the best heel design we've ever seen on any one of these ultra lightweight F50s from Adidas. And then while we're talking about the inside of the football boots, of course the insoles are fully removable and super lightweight as you'd expect. It's a very thin insole made from Light Strike Pro foam, which is one of the flagship foams from the Adidas brand right now. Does this actually feel any different than a standard foam insole? In all honesty, no. And I'm actually a little bit surprised that they didn't do the perforations to shave even more weight. Although if you make a thin foam insole and then perforate it all the way through, it then becomes very flimsy. So for the sake of structure and longevity, I do appreciate this design choice from Adidas. And as far as insoles go, it's run of the mill. But again, what do you really expect from a football boot that weighs 130 grams? Which leads us into the final concern that I think many would have in regards to a football boot this light, and that is the overall performance, which of course brings us to the base of this boot, where you're going to find the hyper light F50 speed system. Like I said, a revamped take on the F50 sprint frame tooling that is entirely made from plastic. That's definitely on the thinner side and very flexible. This, of course, makes it look like it's super responsive, but how easily this bends can definitely fool you into thinking that there's a lot of responsiveness here. This is a very flexible sole plate paired up with a very pliable and, dare I say, flexible upper. So if underfoot responsiveness is what you're after, it's just not here. This is not helping you propel yourself in any way, shape, or form. However, considering how thin it is and how light the boots are, it does feel remarkably solid underfoot. No issues with stud pressure whatsoever. However, speaking of the studs, those have also been modified for the sake of weight savings, which could potentially be a deal breaker for some people in that the studs themselves are actually smaller in size relative to the normal F50 Elite. About the same length, but definitely smaller, and that does lead to slightly less bite and slightly less traction in almost every scenario, again, compared to the normal F50. Here are the two stud patterns side by side, just to give you a little point of comparison. The heel studs are also smaller on the EVO. Having said that, I wouldn't go as far as to say that I had an issue with traction when it came to what the EVO has on offer from this FG stud pattern, but certainly it doesn't provide quite as much bite or aggression as what you'd get from the Elite model, as well as a lot of other speed boots, so do keep that in mind. Also, speaking of stud patterns, this is the FG layout, and I'm anticipating the EVO only being available with an FG stud pattern, which has historically always been the case when it comes to these super light F50 variants, whereas the normal F50 Elite will probably be released with an FG, an AG, as well as an SG sole plate as we get more and more colorways. In other words, if you regularly play on artificial grass, I don't necessarily think that this stud pattern is bad for that playing surface because of the smaller stud shape. It does allow for a little bit more freedom to twist and pivot even on such an abrasive surface. However, because the boot is only 130 grams and artificial grass is as abrasive as we all know that it is, for the sake of the longevity of your boots, $300 super lightweight football boots on AG, I wouldn't bet on them lasting a super long time. And then when it comes to the fit and feel on feet, again, I think the expectation when you hear a football boot is this light is going to be A, that it's so thin and flimsy that it just doesn't feel good, or B, it's so stiff and rigid because they tried to make it so they wouldn't fall apart. And fortunately for the Hyperfast EVO, it suffers from neither of those issues. Again, considering the 130 gram weight range that they fall into, they are remarkably comfortable. I myself am even surprised. I wasn't expecting them to feel uncomfortable because we've obviously seen Adidas do really light and thin uppers in the past. This is not their first rodeo, but these are remarkably impressive, especially the sole plate. Historically, when they've gone this lightweight, the sole plate almost feels like it's too thin to the point where you can feel all the studs. This one does not have that problem. It's nice and solid underfoot, and obviously the boot as a whole is very soft and flexible. Maybe not soft, but definitely pliable. It moves nicely with your feet, and of course, they are so light that you pretty much cannot feel them. Running around in these boots is truly an experience. Out of the box, I would describe them as surprisingly comfortable, and after about 20 minutes of wear or so, the upper heats up and will stretch a little bit. Because it's so thin, it's not necessarily going to hold its shape perfectly. There's going to be that little bit of give. That's of course the case with every football boot. So do keep in mind that in terms of that locked in responsive feel that you get straight out of the box, that does, I don't know if diminish is the right word, but it certainly does get a little bit wider as you wear the boots in, where they still feel secure and move nicely with you, but they definitely don't have the same amount of structure that you'd get from, again, the much more beefed up in comparison standard F50 Elite, as well as most other speed boots for that matter. Having said that, with the laces tied tight, everything wraps your foot really nicely. I'm quite impressed with that. Again, like I talked about, the heel lockdown is very good. And from a general fit perspective, they do definitely fit snug, but I don't think that they are so narrow to the point where you need to have narrow feet to wear them. I think these will work well for most people, although if you do have excessively wide feet, as with most speed boots, probably not the best idea. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is pretty well perfect, if not slightly roomier than the usual 9.5 because of how thin the material is. Like I said, it does stretch just that little bit, so if you need the extra room, these are actually going to be a little bit more of what I'm going to describe as a relaxed fit relative to the standard F50 Elite, but that is not to say that they are sloppy in terms of how they wrap your foot. It's a very close feel, it's a very thin feel, and obviously one that is also ridiculously lightweight. Either way, for the vast majority of people, I would recommend going true to size. Where in conclusion, I really like the F50 EVO, not only because I think it's a good pair of football boots, but because they're just extremely fun to play in. Where for me, having tried just about everything, what makes a football boot stand out is the experience that it has to offer. And at 130 grams or 133 in a size 9.5 US, these give you that weightless sensation that no other football boot currently on the market can offer you. And when you pair in the fact that they're as comfortable as they are, fit as well as they do, and of course give you that raw barefoot sensation, if you like the idea of playing in football boots that feel like you're not wearing football boots, this is ideal. Of course, being as light as they are, long-term durability is always the question, and as much as I don't like the idea of a $300 pair of match day football boots, if you really do love the idea of that weightless feel, and of course, if your budget allows for it, I could definitely see the F50 Elite and the EVO being that 1-2 punch if you want to go full F50 for the season when it comes to both training as well as matches. Either way, I am confident in saying that as of right now, the Adidas F50 EVO is the best super lightweight football boot I've ever worn.